I want to welcome our audience to this L.E.A.R.N podcast. It is in these podcasts that L.E.A.R.N wants you to meet experts that can help you in your work as school leaders or perhaps partners in the education landscape. The topic for this podcast is school security, and our guest is Aaron Roth, Principal over Federal Strategy and Security at the Chertoff Group. You will find on the L.E.A.R.N website, under the research page, under the COE of Safety and the element of Technology Tools, research in this area being discussed, along with potential resources to access. Aaron, I want to welcome you to the L.E.A.R.N podcast. It is really good to have you here to speak with us about this super important topic, obviously top of mind for school leaders across the country. Now, before we get into the podcast itself, I want to ask about your extensive work background and in the area of security systems, and just really encourage you to please share with the audience that experience, because you have a wealth of experience here that really caught my attention.
Well, that's great, David, and I really appreciate you having me on. And like you said, this is a critical topic. I mean, when you think about safety issues domestically here in the United States, I mean, for that matter, globally, I mean, you know, what higher prize is there in terms of precious resources than our kids, right?
Right.
And so protecting them and thinking about their safety at school, I mean, it's unfortunate that we have to, but as we've seen over the years, some tragedy can, strike schools. And it definitely is something that I know from a Chertoff Group perspective, and certainly Secretary Chertoff, who was, Secretary of Homeland Security, it's top of mind for him as well. So when we think about security and safety, there's not many things more important than thinking about school systems and making sure our kids are safe while they're there.
Right. And so you've been engaged in obviously a lot of crisis management planning in your career. You're a military individual. Would you share with the audience some of that experience?
Sure, absolutely. I started, back in the early 90s. I went to the Coast Guard Academy and graduated, and ended up most of the 90s or so participating in law enforcement operations in the Caribbean. I did quite a bit of drug law enforcement, a lot of human smuggling operations, those sorts of things. I tell people, I was at all the islands in the Caribbean, but not for vacation purposes. So I got to see a lot of cool stuff, but not necessarily the way in which, most people would like to see the Caribbean islands.
Right.
But I spent, most of the decade down there, obviously seeing a lot, seeing the tragedy of, violence created by drug trafficking and human trafficking, and just, the overall situation in terms of movement of mostly cocaine from South America into Central America, Mexico, and United States. And, just the complete, sort of violence that is all around drug
Right.
smuggling,
Mm-hmm.
I saw firsthand. And that was really eye-opening. I mean, it was a great mission. I really believed in it. But taught me a lot about, the importance when you think about school systems down in Central America. I mean, part of the problem for what we see on the southwest border is the violence that occurs in those countries, and just, parents trying to get their kids out of that violence, right?
Right.
And I'm certainly not advocating, going to the southwest border, but you saw firsthand, the level of violence created by drug trafficking. And so after the 90s, of course, 9/11 happened, and I was able to transition from the early 2000s to about 2012 or so into more of a counterterrorism level of effort. We just happened to be sort of right place, right time as an organization to be able to work alongside the WARCOM community, which is a special operations entity, and sort of provide some backfill and support. Our units were working overseas in the Middle East, North Africa, throughout that time, and, really sort of sharpen the pen, so to speak, when it comes to, all right, I've done sort of the drug law enforcement side of things. Now I've seen the counterterrorism side of things. And, again, just seeing firsthand the impact associated with terrorism and the challenge and violence that brings. And then spent a year at the Center, CSIS, which is the Center for International Security. It's a think tank here in Washington, D.C. And then I was able to be on Paul Zumkoff, who was a commandant of the Coast Guard. His staff as his advisor And I did that for 3 years before retiring. And, making the decision that a lot of parents have to, where I didn't want to move anymore. So I ended up retiring, for the benefit of my kids to be able to stay in high school. And then the former vice commandant of the Coast Guard, Peter Neffinger, was at TSA, the Transportation Security Administration. And so he pulled me over there, and I was able to be an executive there in operations support and helping lead that organization for 3 years. And then 4 years ago, almost, I spent my time here at the Chertoff Group, where we do any number of things. But, one of the primary focus areas for us is security risk management work, and focused on the private sector and also, government entities like school systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that's what, when we got the opportunity to connect a few months back, it was just so exciting to hear the passion of the Chertoff Group for engaging and supporting school districts, because you guys are large government contracts, large commercial contracts, and we're a very different kind of entity, very, segmented, and not just by states, but by locales within states. So it's a little different kind of adventure. And, the conversations we've had, it's clear that you have a heart for, and the secretary has a heart for, really coming in and helping school districts with this landscape, but also advocating for school districts at the state level and perhaps at the local level as well, in terms of ways in which they can start looking at security. And I know we often think about the physical security, and we're going to talk about that today, but also the cyber and AI space. And, as we look at the current threat landscape, I'd just like you to share with the audience what kind of your feel is about what we need to be aware of, both from the physical space, but also that cyber and AI space.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that's sort of the buzzword, right, in security right now is converged security challenges, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that. I think, sort of at the geopolitical level globally, I mean, it doesn't take much past the front page of the newspaper to see all the security challenges we're facing globally. Mm-hmm. I think most of my career, I spent 30 years in the Department of Homeland Security. Most of my career, I look back and I say, at every juncture of my career, I remember people saying, man, this is the most complex security environment we've ever seen. And yet we just keep saying that, right? And I do think it's true. I don't think it's an exaggeration. I think, as, we continue moving through our lives, and as more technologies develop, as more tools, as different societal changes occur, as different global, competitor sort of relationships change, the environment tends to get only more complex. And so when you think about what's going on in the Middle East right now, you think about, Russia and Ukraine, you think about China and where we are in the relationship with them. You think about, the challenges of criminality globally and domestically. You think about all of the things we've seen, domestic, events. You almost can't say anything without sort of, inciting some sort of frustration in people these days. And so just taken in total between sort of global events, domestic events, it's a highly complex environment. And so why is that important to schools? And I think, fundamentally, I think schools, and we always talk about this in the Chertoff Group, and the secretary's fond of saying, you will never be able to eliminate risk. All you can do is manage it and make informed decisions based upon the risks that you see. So from sort of the executive leadership, perspective of schools, or any organization for that matter, the only requirement you have fundamentally in sort of doing the right thing is making sure that you understand what those risks are and how they impact, in this case, obviously schools.
Yeah.
And there's some things, and I think best practices there that we can get into as we go forward. But, just the complexity of all those global events, the domestic events. We think about what's happening in cybersecurity over the past decade. Almost every device we carry now, brings some threat to us, right? Yep. You add social media on top of that, and it's probably, the secretary was on a panel this past week talking about, how social media is used for nefarious purposes. So you think about that with kids, you think about that with anybody that's using social media, that you are a target in social media. And you also have a responsibility to think about, what your risk surface is when you're dealing with social media. And that can be anything, right? They're trying to get you to buy something. They're
Right.
trying to get you to, do something that you otherwise may or may not realize is happening.
Right.
And I'm not here to, suggest that social media is a terrible thing. It's not. It's incredibly powerful, but that power can be used for nefarious purposes. And I think we see that in the AI modeling within social media, and sort of anything that we use can push us in a direction that, subconsciously we may be doing that we don't even realize in sort of a conscious sense.
Right.
And so all of that plays out day in, day out, and it's no more apparent than schools where kids are on social media, more than anyone.
Well, maybe not even more than the adults,
Yeah.
but it's fascinating. You use that word complex, and I think part of the complexity actually is the audience that school districts serve. In many cases, may think it's not complex. Like there are very simple solutions, and if you just do X, it will result in Y. And in many cases, that's just not how it works. And I find we've dealt with school security issues where I've been a superintendent. Obviously, I know many superintendents who've dealt with school security issues, and you're trying to balance that risk against creating an environment that's a learning environment.
Yep.
And so it becomes more complex than just simply, hardening the target is a favorite term of many people. You just need to make the target harder. And yet we want to make certain that we're also recognizing we're a school district. We are a learning institution. We're not a prison or a military complex. It's like, this is not who we are. So I find, that word is probably an appropriate word. And as we think about this, then, and I'm going to kind of skip to question 3, which is, based on your experience, then what are some of the ways in which a district could really manage that risk? Especially, I'm guessing, in communication, but otherwise some perhaps best practices that you think would be something that districts would want to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should mention, this is a bit of a passion issue for me as well. My oldest daughter is a school teacher in North Carolina. So not only have my kids, I have 4 of them went through school, obviously, but, now I have a daughter teaching. So, a lot of this hits home with me. And I certainly appreciate the fact that, you can't make schools prisons, right? And sort of pull on that thread a little bit and say, okay, well, what can they do? I think, first and foremost, when you think about change, and this is not going to be surprising to any of your audience, but you think about it through the lens of people, process, technology, and I always add culture into that as well. So, if you're a leader in the school system, I think that's a helpful framework for thinking about, are we doing all we can across the risk landscape relative to people, relative to technology, relative to processes, and relative to culture? And I'll talk about a few of those things. The most important thing from my perspective is no leader is ever going to be, criticized negatively if they fully considered the risk and they made decisions based on the complex world they live in on that to the best of their ability with the most informed inputs as they possibly can get. Where people tend to get in trouble is where they haven't examined it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I say that because, my recommendation would always be, as a best practice, to have some sort of risk committee. And I think, most school systems, most businesses, most organizations understand enterprise risk management, and the degree to which they have a focus on security relative to that construct, I think it's incredibly beneficial. There should be regular conversations around safety and security. And literally for school systems, to me, they're two sides of the same coin. I think it's more appropriate and easier to think about safety for kids at school than it is security. But to me, as long as you sort of have a lexicon that everybody's comfortable with, you can make the same informed decision. So number one for me would be, have a group of people that are the right folks for your particular school system, regularly meeting and talking about safety and security related issues. That would be number one. And then I think once you have that, which is kind of the people element, right? You then need some process around that. Okay, well, what does it look like? We talk, what are the outcomes of those conversations? And I think, deliberate processes to fully adjudicate what, that group determines to be significant relative risk, right? And when we think about risk, we think about it in sort of three dimensions. We think about, the consequence of an event. And obviously with schools, you can't give much higher consequence. It's the kids and the teachers, and just sort of we see the national, impact when even one school gets hit. And so then we think about vulnerability, and I think that's where the most work can be done. And then lastly, we sort of think about the threat itself. And so as long as you have a group of people thinking through those three dimensions, and then whatever has been identified as potential, concern, that there's a process for thinking through, okay, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to mitigate it? Number one, what are the possibilities for mitigation?
Right.
And then, given all the limitations that exist out there and the complexities that exist, make an informed decision about how to deal with it, objectively, right?
Right.
And then I think, you're in a position where you've responsibly dealt with the risks that you're facing. And then that may be that you add some technologies that sort of go back to that framework, right?
Some layered work. Yeah.
That's right. And then, it's always a culture that matters as well, and instilling a culture within your school system of teachers and whatnot about how to think about safety and security, so that everybody's kind of pulling on the oar together.
Right.
With that.
I mean, I'm just fascinated, Aaron. You've taken the complexity of this, and you've really created a concise approach to it just in a very short amount of time. I was just sitting here trying to pull it all in. And it strikes me, obviously, partnering with people who have expertise is really important. And that's something that you guys are interested in doing, is really partnering with districts and maybe having these conversations and then bringing other potential partners to the table. Like, we have a really great partner with L.E.A.R.N called True North Consulting Group. They do some great stuff, and seeing how these different entities come together to really support our districts in this important work. One of the things that I wonder about, though, is kind of a next, and I've already made a decision because of the nature of this conversation, Aaron. You and I are going to have another conversation about AI and information security separate, because there's just too much here. But I think the next question becomes, so you come out of that security meeting or set of meetings, however you want to describe that, you have some clarity around this. What would be your kind of advice, if you will, on how you communicate that to your audience? Now, in a business, obviously, you're communicating that to your employees, but in the case of schools, you're communicating that to your public. Do you have some thoughts on that you wouldn't mind sharing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I am, completely sympathetic to the fact that, schools in particular are trying to educate kids, but they're also dealing with, you think about concentric circles around that, kids in the middle. Mm-hmm. You're dealing with, political environment, you're dealing with parents, you're dealing with, any number of sort of stakeholders around that. And that can be complex in of itself, just trying to communicate clearly and concisely in ways that, people can hear it. You're never going to please everybody. That is for certain, right?
Right.
But I think, one of the most, powerful communication tools in my mind, I think schools are great about inviting parents in, PTAs, and all the other things that are there for parents to, communicate with school leadership about, but it's describing processes to people. So let's take an incident, that happened in Uvalde, Texas. It's tragic. Okay, for every other school system out there, what do you do after an event like that? I mean, you want to show that you've taken action. And I think one of the ways is to describe your process. Like, hey, just so you know, this is how we manage safety and security for your kids. And in some instances, it may be appropriate to invite, outsiders, so to speak, into those conversations. I'm not saying all the time, but maybe there's an annual meeting, and I'm sure many schools do this and are way ahead of sort of anything that I would provide as advice. But inviting people into those processes, I think, can be really impactful. And again, realizing you're never going to please everybody. Those are very difficult meetings to manage. But to the extent you can show people what you're doing, I think is really important. And then when you make decisions on, let's say, mitigations of some sort, you're going to put a new security system in, you've got a new protocol with the police, and the local
Right.
police, whatever it is, I think, taking the time to communicate that does a couple things. One is it obviously gives stakeholder community an opportunity to understand, that you're putting time and energy into this because it's an important issue. And then I think secondly, and sometimes people don't realize, when you're overt in public about those things, it makes, others who may have some ill intent in mind second guess, what they're going to do. And you'll hear the term a lot in security called security theater, which effectively means you're doing something that may not have any real substantive, sort of strategy or mitigation behind it, but it looks like there's something going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's often used as, sort of a negative kind of connotation, but in reality, it can be very compelling. That just by saying we are doing these things, it can be enough. The analogy I use is turn your lights on in your house at nighttime, because if somebody's thinking about doing something, they're going to go to the house that has the lights off.
Right. Yeah.
That's a little bit of theater, but
Right.
it works.
Yeah, because your house may not be any safer, but in reality, it's created a certain image in that perpetrator's mind. Yeah, that makes good sense. That makes really good sense. Well, Aaron, unfortunately, our time is really, we've gone over time, actually. And like I said, I want more conversation. So I'm going to tell our audience, we're going to have another conversation around AI and information security, because that's also something districts are dealing with a lot.
Absolutely.
But if a district or partner wanted to explore working with you, how would they go about contacting you?
Yeah, I think the easiest way is our Chertoff Group website, Chertoff, and Chertoff Group. We have a website there. It's easy to get in touch with us. If anyone would like to get in touch with me directly, it's as simple as aaron.roth@chertoffgroup.com. And I know no one will remember that, but I'm sure
we'll have it printed for them. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, we'll have it taken care of. Well, I want to thank you, Aaron, for being a part of this important work of supporting our students in our schools. And I want to thank you for your participation in the L.E.A.R.N. podcast.
Absolutely. Pleasure to do it. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.